welcome back to another episode of the 706 podcast, where we discuss, debate, and argue which movies are the 706 greatest films of all time. For today, we are discussing a film that Kirk referred to as the licorice pizza of Christopher Nolan movies, 2020's Tenet, which is kind of an interesting film in which there's really, I guess you might argue, two or three storylines that are kind of essentially happening, right? There's a storyline of a mom trying to reconnect with her son, a storyline of these group of people trying to essentially save the universe, save the world, and a lot of other things happening in between that are going to require Kirk to explain the whole movie for an hour and a half, which he will proceed to do now. But no, this is one of those weird, kind of rare cases. I don't know if we've ever had this before, maybe besides Blade Runner, but this is a movie where we had all seen it, I believe, beforehand in some form or another. Okay, actually, never mind. But we had seen, for the most part, most of it, or had been some sort of familiarity with it. But there's a sort of different approach to this movie, I think, that we have to take, which is our instant reactions that Tony and Connor had, the kind of somewhat distaste of Kirk trying to get through it that first time, and all sorts of things. So, one thing we could deal with is our motivations and why, and what didn't work that first time. Did anything change? What's going on here? And whether or not the movie really works. But just quick initial opinions. Let's start with Connor. Actually, I feel like he doesn't usually go first, but Connor, you had seen this before. You had kind of stuck up for doing an episode on it, if I remember right. What did you think about it this time?
Thanks. Yeah, no, I would love to just say that I think you mentioned, for me, I'd already seen it, and I would say that I definitely liked the first time. I admired its ambition. Yes, it was a head scratcher, but I thought it was very cool. It was a very cool movie. I probably would have said it maybe doesn't stack up quite. It's not quite as dense as and cool as Inception or something. And my opinion is substantially the same this time. I have to say I think a lot was lost in the second watch as opposed to gained, because so much of what you think would be the kind of clues, the sort of explanations, the kind of the sort of the mythology behind what we're seeing is all kind of rather random and hard to explain anyway, even when you know what it is. There's not that much pleasure in seeing Robert Pattinson appear at the very beginning. Again, it just doesn't, the confusion is actually more interesting than knowing the answer. I kind of started laughing. I smiled, I grinned from ear to ear at the part where we first enter the, well, it's not the first inversion chamber, but it's the second one that comes kind of in the middle of the movie when they're in Estonia. And we see the villain and the love interest sort of going in, and then our protagonist is walking on the other side, and we see someone running backwards, very subtly, from the corner of our eye. And it's just it's the first time we've seen that actually happen. I mean, we sort of see the protagonist appears in the airport sequence where he has to fight himself. That's very subtle. Obviously that person's reversed, but it's not nearly as ridiculous looking as it is in that very moment. And there's something just very cool about that. There's something very just he's going there. There's something very just the mind blowing quality of it, I think, is cool. But I just think that it doesn't lend itself to more, to seeing it a second time. It doesn't add anything. In fact, I think it kind of takes away from it a little bit. Now, of course, what I was watching this time is I was going to try to pay attention a lot more to the dialogue, which I have to say the first time I watched it, I missed, I think, the first half of the movie practically. I was just watching mouths move. I could not understand the dialogue, and I still think that's a problem. It's it's mixed poorly, and honestly, it's not written very clearly. I think especially towards the beginning, there's some weird choices with the dialogue. They kind of talk in a kind of slangy way. This is kind of true of Inception, but they kind of talk in a sort of abbreviated, not particularly clear way. Though I guess there are moments too where they seem to spell things out maybe a bit too much, but I think for the most part, it's there's a lot of just kind of glossing over details or kind of explaining things in a bit too rapid kind of manner that we know from Inception. It's supposed to feel propulsive and cool, and and we're not beating around the bush the characters are. We're supposed to know as much as the characters do, that kind of thing. But I still felt it very disorienting. And then again, thinking about the script, what did I learn more from really knowing what the dialogue was this time? And I'm not sure I did. That being said, I noticed some things. I noticed the kind of the care and attention to detail, which I did. I mean, obviously it's a great kind of blockbuster, grand blockbuster action film, and it tries to be that, and it tries to be a little bit elevated, a little bit self-consciously, a little bit self-aware about that. And I admire that about it. I have my various little like things I noticed, my sort of like, notes, I could take on, the symbols here and the symbols there. But ultimately, I don't find this plot line, especially as regards to kind of the sci-fi plot line, particularly interesting. I do kind of like the weird kind of relationship drama at the heart of all of this, which is very interesting and feels almost. I was laughing before we started this episode, like, what if it's, it feels like almost it could be based on real life. I was speculating if Nolan had his own, marital issues. Of course, this would be quite extreme to have such marital issues, but there's something very raw and like human, right, about that in a way that the larger kind of sci-fi story isn't. So anyway, these are my sort of lukewarm, takes. I think I'm still a little bit muddled. My opinion didn't change fundamentally on the movie. There's a lot to like admire about it, but again, I think it's like, it doesn't stand up to his other works in his oeuvre. I think like, even Dunkirk, I think I have to say, like, looking back on it, I think I admire more for its like what it manages to accomplish. Whereas this, it just feels like it's trying to chase the highs of Inception, but it doesn't have that wonderful kind of meta filmic aspect to it. And I will say with Inception, I find myself like kind of not really enjoying the experience of watching it, but at least I can really like, I can dig it, whereas this movie, like, I kind of dig it, but I also, I don't dig it as much even as I do Inception. But that's my take.
All right, interesting. So Connor's kind of had like a movement from the sort of positive to the sort of lukewarm, at least a bit more lukewarm. As for the dialogue, yeah, that was a big problem for me the first time. And I kind of went along with things for the ride. The second time in rewatching it, I don't know if anyone else did, so I'll be curious to know, but I actually put on the captions and was following along with dialogue that way. But let's see, we'll go to Tony next then and see what he had to think. And I believe you had seen this movie before.
Yes, I saw this one in the theater. I gathered all the elderly I could find. I brought a very sick cousin of mine, but it was a good time for all of us. No, yes, I did. I did see this when it came out. I'm sorry, I did. I wore a mask in the theater. What do you want me to say? All right. And left kind of perplexed, a little disappointed. And but the thing is, though, is like, Nolan is like one of my guys, and like in high school, Nolan was one of my like big gateways. And I think a lot of like millennial dudes had this experience of like watching the Dark Knight movies or watching Inception or something, getting really into them, and that being kind of a gateway to other things, or Nolan being kind of an early director you kind of gravitate to, because he makes these big blockbusters that are a little brainy, or got a little more pretentious, got a little more going on, and so on. But I found that like he hasn't made a movie in a decade now that's really connected with me in that way. I still love a lot of his films, but the last new movie I saw of his that like really impressed me was actually The Dark Knight Rises. And so, yeah, so I didn't love it, and I was kind of eager to rewatch it, like Connor said, with subtitles at home, and kind of get more of a sense of a grounding. And I think that the actual plot is like, I can follow it okay. Like, it's not too hard to follow on a second watch, but I do agree that it is written in kind of an unnecessarily confusing way. The way the characters talk to each other, and Connor says slangy, it feels very like, almost like these are professionals talking as professionals do about their jobs, right? It's not for our benefit. It's as to how they would talk to each other. And that's kind of the appeal of it, is it's like, we're being let in on this like private world. We're being let into this world of that exists so far beyond our day-to-day existences. And it's very, very, this movie, and on this watch, it really hit home. It is so Michael Mann influence. Like, Christopher Nolan clearly like loves Michael Mann, is obsessed with Michael Mann. This is so Michael Mann, like everything about it, because that dialogue and that way of talking to each other, the professionals thing, and Inception's all about that too. Like, that is classic Michael Mann. He's all about that. Stuff like the speedboat scene where the protagonist is taking Elizabeth Debicki, I believe. He's taking her out on the speedboat in the water, or just the shots of him and Robert Pattinson wearing suits, like walking and talking. That's just like Miami Vice. Like, I just got straight Miami Vice vibes in those moments. And I think that like he's kind of chasing that feeling, as well as, of course, spy movies. It's a spy movie, it's a Michael Mann movie, it's a mind-bending Christopher Nolan movie. He's trying to kind of do all these things and do them up right. And I think that there are moments where he captures that kind of man feeling of sort of the more like almost impressionistic kind of emotional, like the fact that the story almost is so difficult or so kind of perplexing, I think is part of the intended effect of the movie, to be in this place of like being overwhelmed with information and being kind of disconnected and not being grounded in anything. I think that's part of the movie's argument, is just like, I think it's about the 21st century. It's about being overwhelmed with information. And basically this idea of there being a world beneath our world, it's very Adam Curtis, or a world of information beneath our perception that goes infinitely deep and that we can never fully understand. And every old structure, every old system is completely unreliable or fake. And even time, even the most fundamental way we perceive the world, is no longer reliable. And we're going forward through times and backward through times. And I do think that the movie does a poor job of communicating what exactly is going on in the moment, in terms of who is going forward in time, who is going back in time. And it's coming at you so fast. I feel like Inception did just such a better job with a similarly dense plot, if not a more dense plot. But I thought it was so much more effective at communicating with the audience what was going on. I think the other reason Inception works so much better for me, and I suspect most viewers, is that I think the emotional core of the story is so rock solid. The heart of his movies is always the parent-child relationship. That's what he comes back to again and again and again. That's what he cares about. That's what motivates him to make these movies, or that's like the core of it emotionally. And like Inception does such an amazing job with Leonardo DiCaprio and his wife and his kids. He wants to get back to his kids. It's a very simple story, but it sells the emotion of that so well in the writing and in the performance. And also with Cillian Murphy and his father and their relationship. Both of those relationships are really well defined and very emotionally resonant in the movie. Here, like, I feel like Elizabeth Debicki and her son is just so like, I just don't feel anything for the son. I find her dynamic with her husband a little bit more interesting, like that kind of, that really the abusive, and she's this kept woman. There's the whole thing with the forgery. I feel like there's just kind of more going on, and it's kind of an interesting dynamic. But I feel like the son is he's in the script just because he needed some kind of emotional engine for the movie. And it frankly feels a little bit half-assed. But again, maybe that's intentional. I mean, our protagonist is named the protagonist. That can be interesting, but I feel like it just doesn't connect for me. It doesn't all come together. So admire a lot of things about this movie, but ultimately it just feels like a kind of a worse version of Inception. I think that's what I would say I come away with.
All right, interesting. We're going to have to refute a number of those claims as it comes back to me, but interesting stuff from Tony, who had seen the film before in a theater with many sick people, as he was saying. So now we'll move on to Kirk, originally the Christopher Nolan fanboy of the bunch, but let's see what he has to say.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoy Nolan as much as the next bro. I think that Tony might be a bigger Nolan guy than I am. But yeah, I mean, Inception's fantastic. I did like Interstellar, so I guess that puts me ahead of Tony in that regard. I thought the Batman movies were all right. I wasn't blown away by them, but yes, this film is quite something, isn't it? This was my first watch, my first completed watch. I have attempted to watch this movie before. So let me give you the audience some insight into how I watch films. I am very detail oriented, I would say. If I miss a line of dialogue, if I feel like I do not fully understand a concept, if I feel like I'm not experiencing an intended emotion, I often will pause and or rewind, and consequently it takes me much longer than the average person to watch a film. I could not imagine having seen this film in the theater. I would have thrown my hands up at the 45-minute mark and just looked at the pretty pictures. It's quite something. It really is. The way I would describe it is it's the least intuitive film I've ever seen. If I were to describe it, it would just be this pervasive feeling of frustration and consternation at not quite being able to grasp what is going on. You have glimpses of it, right? It's the equivalent of trying to, rub your belly and pat your head at the same time. It really feels that way, where your brain is almost, we are so focused on linearity, and yeah, this is to Nolan's credit. Like, it's like almost a cognitive exercise, where I found myself after one of my sessions, and it probably took me about 4 hours to watch this film, maybe longer. I found after one of those viewing sessions that I was looking at things as though they were about to be rewound, or as they were about to be like, as if I were inverted, and I was seeing, the concept of linearity was really kind of shaken in those moments. And so that's never happened, for me with a movie before, I guess. It's almost like how people describe when they play a lot of Tetris, they start seeing the shapes on the walls, and they start, seeing everything looks like a Tetris piece. It's kind of like that. So yeah, this is a mind bender, a mind melter for sure. My initial impressions are that I often struggle with movies relating to time travel. In the movie, it's stated very early on, when we're kind of through the exposition, that we're meant to view it as reverse chronology as opposed to time travel, which, the entropy of items is reversed, as if that is an intuitive concept to grasp for anybody without a degree in, I don't know, metaphysics or quantum mechanics. It's just, I don't know why he chose this like scientific hypothetical to run with. I'm not sure. And I guess that's where the crux of the movie comes in, is, for me, I can only evaluate it based on how strong the metaphor is. And I'm trying to kind of parse that out. And, Tony is talking about the 21st century. That's where my kind of interest with the film lies, is like, I'm not going to be able to understand the granular details of it completely. I'm pretty sure, given his scrupulosity regarding the physics and these, the mechanics of a movie like Interstellar or Inception, where like Interstellar, they rendered what a real black hole would be, and I think it took like 100 seconds to render one frame in that, the singularity scene. So I'm sure the science is like sound, but it's based on like this postulation that if this were to be possible, here's how it would work based on our current understanding of space and time. And it's hard for me to watch this movie and not just see time loops everywhere. I don't know if everybody else sees that. I think like everything here in this movie ends up in a time loop. And so I kind of like, the get out of jail free card for Nolan was like the multiverse and like the multiple worlds theory. Maybe I need to go on YouTube and watch an explanation, but I think that's to its detriment, really, because if I were just, Ed, a guy who worked at Home Depot in Bronson, Missouri, and I went to the movie theater and I was like, yeah, let me see, I loved myself some Dark Knight, I loved myself some Inception, let me just go have some fun, get away from the pandemic. And then I sat down to this, and the action itself isn't as particularly riveting. Like, if you just watch the film and you don't pay attention to like the science behind everything, and you're not intrigued by that, I don't think this is like a particularly riveting film, is it? I mean, we don't even know what the stakes are half the time. We know the world's going to end, but at the same time, shouldn't the world have ended already if they failed? And so that's, you get into these paradoxes. Everywhere you turn in this film is a paradox. How can somebody enter an inverter? They must be immortal, because they have to be able to re-enter the inverter in the past, or in the future, or in the past, but all these things have happened already in the future. Anyways, I'm not gonna. It's kind of addicting actually to think in those terms, but I think there's a level of detachment, of derealization, right? And I think Nolan falls for kind of these trappings where he wants everything to feel really cool, right? He wants, like you've mentioned, the dialogue. He wants the dialogue to feel cool and esoteric. He wants the locations to be cool, like Oslo and Tallinn, like New York, that's played, LA, that's played out. We're going to go to Oslo and Tallinn and Mumbai and Vietnam. And it's like what I would call like the Bourne Identity syndrome, where everybody has to be the best at what they do and everything has to look super fucking cool. And that's how you string the audience along, kind of. So I think that's a little manipulative, or I guess it's used as like a foundation to cover up the blemishes that really are apparent. Maybe I'm just not smart enough for this film, but I don't understand how to grasp any parts of the emotional resonance without first feeling just completely flooded by confusion. And it only worsens throughout the film. Like, at the end, I'm not sure to understand, was Robert Pattinson inverted the whole time? If he was, why didn't he need an oxygen mask? There's like 80 different questions like that. If he killed Priya before they met, how come he met her later? Or every time you go to an inverter, I guess you clone yourself. Maybe that's beside the point. I guess maybe I'm ranting a little bit, and I apologize. But in terms of the Nolan hierarchy, this is toward the bottom, I would say. I just think it's highly ambitious, and I'm glad it was made. I say that a lot on this podcast. I'm glad something was made. At the same time, I don't want to have to fight a director. I like some struggle. I like some tug and pull with movies, but I feel like this was just a little too much. It was a little bit, there was a lot of pretension in the film, similar to Licorice Pizza, I felt. And I don't know if it's really the movie that we needed, because I think the ideas that are there, like the idea of time, are us being able to even change the past and change our understanding of the past through how we talk about the past. You could look at things like critical race theory, or you could look at the future and how we change the future. And we talk about collective hopes and expectations for the future, or our understanding of what a future would look like. What does a collective future look like for us? Those are interesting and very Cartesian topics, but I think they get lost when you have like multiple time loops going on simultaneously. And perhaps I just need to, it's like a Pollock painting. If you look too closely, it's just a bunch of lines. You kind of have to like be impressed by it. Like, you have to have it wash over you. And maybe on the second viewing, I would let this film wash over me, though I doubt it. I don't think that's how my mind works. Either way, not exactly for me. Happy I saw it. Happy I got through it. And we'll see. Maybe I'll come around based on what Anthony has to say.
I don't know if I'll be able to pull that off, but very interesting, observations, Kirk. I think there's a lot to unravel. That would probably take another length of the film to really solve. And it goes to something that I think is probably true about the movie that everybody said. It's definitely an imperfect film. There's a lot of imperfections to point out. There's a lot of questions you could point out based on misunderstandings or failures to understand not just the director, but the film on its own level. But let me try to back up and maybe explain why I wanted to do this movie and why I nominated it in the first place, not just because I thought it was an interesting conversation. But my first thing is that I was thinking about what Connor was saying when we were talking about Licorice Pizza in the bonus episode. And when he brought up a sort of very Mark Fisher, Adam Curtis-esque line about our sort of stoppage of culture, our sort of fear of creating anything new that we've led to us being sort of blocked, and which I found a very apt metaphor in this movie that I'll get to in a second. But as for this movie, I think one thing I should say is there's a character, and one of my favorite characters in the movie is Laura, who says, "Don't try to understand it, feel it," which may be the biggest cop out of any kind of line you could throw. But I think it's a really key to my approach in understanding this, which is that as a film fan, or a film person, who's done this podcast, who watches a lot of movies, at least, outside of here. I was never the biggest Christopher Nolan person. I never had the attachment. I wasn't running around with a purple blazer and Heath Ledger hair in 2008. I didn't have a photo of Christopher Nolan on my dorm wall with lipstick stains around it. All that's out the window. And, even Inception, the big one, which we did on the podcast, I don't remember how I voted, but I never had the biggest attachment to it. I never understood that emotional parental core that everybody always talks about. I always thought the kind of marriage there between Leonardo DiCaprio and Marion Cotillard's characters was very hollow. And so I understood that movie mainly as a sort of visceral exercise, something to kind of weapon appetite, but never really kept me full. On the other hand, I did gravitate towards something like Memento, The Prestige, Interstellar, which may be somewhat indicative of my taste. When it comes to Tenet, though, the first time I watched this was a very sort of mixed bag. I liked things and I didn't like things. Of course, I read the different theories, and one of the big ones is one that everybody's talked about online, at least, that this is a film about climate change and the fact that the future is coming back to exact revenge for our failure to take action, which I think is a fine, solid way to kind of get into the movie. I don't want to say it's necessarily the one I want to go with, but I'm fine with it and I like it at times. But I love this idea of just the future coming back. And also this movie not necessarily being about our inability to change the past, but a worry about our inability to change the present. And because of that inability, do we even have an ability to imagine better futures? To play on a question, what kind of futures can we imagine when everything seems lost? Well, the only answer seems to be that all we have are lost futures. And that's a very haunting, sad line that the movie wants to offer. And I think the movie does give us a little bit of a way out. But one time, I'll get to that in a second. So anyway, as I'm kind of approaching this movie, I'm thinking about it. I'm confused by it after that first watch. I want another one, and I wait a little time, and I get another one, and I like it a lot more. But one thing I'm thinking about is one sign of my appreciation is just that this movie was made at all, as you're saying, Kirk. One, for the reason of I love that, there's this director who gets a budget like this, and he is one of the few people in Hollywood who could just get a pass. That no studio exec read this and was like, what the hell? No one's going to understand this. Like, why should we greenlight this huge blockbuster? And of course, there's the COVID question and all sorts of problematic nature there. But, in a world where like we get a bunch of Marvel movies and movies that devote things to fan service, TV shows that rely on intertextuality, that build on each other, that give fans their moments, sometimes it's refreshing, I think, for myself to have a movie like this that just doesn't want to get on an audience's level. It doesn't care about that. It throws it out the window for something, one, that I think is kind of new. What I'm most reminded of is actually reading like these like William Gibson, like pulpy sci-fi novels, or like early Philip K. Dick, where like it just forces you to pick something. It forces you to try to make sense of it as you go along. And I'm not thinking about that in like a David Lynch level of like interpretation. I don't want like a dream interpretation. This isn't a Jodorowsky or Lynch. This is just something like out of that sci-fi tradition that just like says, here's some things, follow along if you can, but otherwise pick up the elements where they may be. Feel the movie, don't try to understand it, which I just found so refreshing and I was so desperately in need of in the moment I think I watched it, which gave me more of an appreciation than I should. But that's one thing. But the other thing I'm thinking about this movie is the more I watch it, the more I think about like the protagonists and Neil, played by Robert Pattinson, and David Washington, as like these really kind of imperfect heroes. They try so hard to be cool, but I think it's the effort to try that's kind of interesting. Like lines are always kind of misspoken. They're a little misunderstood. They're a little off. They don't feel quite right. Even the protagonist is fighting at times is really stilted. The fact that he uses a cheese grater, which often pokes fun at this kind of like Bondy-ish type of like action. It feels something out of the pulp world. But the more we watch it, the more we realize our real heroes are Laura and Kat, played by Elizabeth Debicki, that this is a place and this is a universe where our ideology and our culture have effectively ruined us and ruined a future enough to send them back to haunt us. But in reality, we have these two women, mainly, who are willing to put up a fight against it, and a fight against not just Kenneth Branagh's Sator, but willing to put up a fight and embrace something that seems at least salvageable in our own reality. And that is the love of family, the love of a mother to a daughter, the love of a scientist to her desire to build something for the better world. And I think at the heart, to me, that really gets me and that really fascinates me. Again, I think there's a lot of imperfections. The ending where they kind of spread things out, architect style, like the Triforce of Courage in the Wind Waker, it's just scattered into different pieces. Like what's up with that? All sorts of other problems. But at the end of the day, like I could really, zing on that moment or some of these moments that interest me. And for myself, the visceral elements I think are enough to keep me going when I am lost. They're enough to kind of push me forward. I love that orchestra scene. I love that weird pincer moment happening on the battlefield towards the end. I even love like the cheesy bomb or time bomb that's kind of going off. And so, maybe this is a case of things just falling in the right time, the right place for a viewer. Maybe they're not. But it begs a sort of separate question. So I'll stop talking to stop hogging the microphone. But to get forward, since I know we've all kind of taken a long time to kind of give our thoughts, maybe we could just get down to it, which is to start with you, Kirk, because this is a problem that we've come up with in other movies. Is there a way, Kirk, to maybe appreciate a movie like this in a way that when you don't understand it? And I mean, it's a sort of simple question, but this isn't like a Blue Velvet. This isn't a piece of high art necessarily. This is something firmly in the kind of action sci-fi world. Do you need something like understanding to get you through it, to like it, for that kind of Joe Blow at Home Depot in Bronson, Missouri? Or do you think it's just an exercise of failure?
That's a good question, Anthony. I think it hits at my relationship to art, I guess. And perhaps it's a little, masturbatory in the sense of like I gain validation or satisfaction through some sort of transcendence as opposed to frustration, or any sort of confusion, desolation, right? These are all valid emotions that we can experience throughout our lives that are very informative, right? They tell us what's going on in our body and our environment. And this is like a temperamental thing for me, that it's like, this is how I have been since I've been myself, but I think there have been moments where I've really felt like I was lost in a world, in either like a cinematic or either a book, like a narrative world, where I didn't care that I was lost. And I was so enamored by the world itself, or by the story, the pieces of the story. I could point to like my first watch of Inception is kind of like that. I felt the pain, like Tony said. I kind of felt that yearning that he was experiencing for his kids in a, like this just chaotic world that was so unreal. And yeah, for me, I don't know. It's hard to say. It's hard to know how to appreciate difficult emotions in art. Even when you're looking at something, at MoMA or the Met or something, and it doesn't really strike you. You wonder, is this just my subjective opinion? Is there something wrong with me? Is it not the right day? And those kind of questions do flow through me, and I think that's healthy. But I would put my foot down and say that I don't feel like the action sequences in this film, either because sometimes they're inverted. I don't feel like they really get my heart racing. Even when he's fighting himself, it's just awkward. Like you said, it is, but I think that's purposeful. I mean, because he's fighting somebody who's going in reverse. The opera siege was pretty cool, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's enough like populist moments, like high notes, for someone to really enjoy. But maybe I'm just thinking of, the problem is I'm probably projecting here, of course. But long story short, yeah, Anthony, that's a great question. One that I think we all could probably benefit from is like, how can we enjoy art in other less conventional ways? But to me, I do think the mechanics of the film were a little subpar given Nolan's standards. So I will say that.
Connor, how did you feel? I mean, you could answer the same question if you'd like, but also sort of curious to go back to what you were saying in your initial thoughts, especially comparing that second one to the first one about enjoying the confusion. What's that sort of experience kind of like? And then I'm kind of curious, is like, does that play of the confusion tie into any of like your cultural reading of the movie and some of that stuff you were getting out of it? Or, it sounded like you were going that direction.
Well, Anthony, thanks. I mean, and I agree with a lot with what Kirk was saying as well, but it's hard to say. So one thing I'd like to address was you mentioned, I think you alluded to Tony's poster, Christopher Nolan. It wasn't just lipstick stains. As his roommate, I can tell you that. But sorry, I was waiting to make that crack for a while. Anyway, so yeah, to the question of like the confusion, I think fundamentally, and I have this problem with Inception too. The pleasure is coming from like, I know that Nolan knows what he's doing. It's just that I can't quite figure it out. I guess there's a sublimity in that like, I know there's a grand design behind this. It's just, and I can almost see how it works, but I don't quite get it. But like, yeah, I do think that robs, as Kirk was saying, the action sequences of some of their appeal because you're distracted. I think in some ways the best sequence is the opera part where we're not expected to know anything. And it's totally fine, right? We're just, we get it. There's a bomb. There's a bunch of guys with guns. There's sleeping gas. There's all these things. Like, we kind of get these things. We don't know what it's all about, but like we don't feel like we're missing anything. Whereas later during like the car chase sequence, okay, we see the car in reverse. We're like, what the hell? And then eventually, it comes back again. And when we do the reverse through that same car chase sequence, it just gets very confusing, trying to keep track of like, well, what was our protagonist doing at this moment exactly? But is it the same moment? Because it's in reverse. It becomes very hard to like fathom what's going on. And I think it then becomes, I think action on any level, I don't care if you're Joe Blow, I don't care who you are, like fundamentally, this is like action is an intellectual thing. I mean, it's like, it's about, feeling that you understand, what's going on. You have a grasp. I don't think you can have like good action where you're literally confused. That might be a different kind of experience, but it's not a good action, film. That being said, I think, no, there's something that's very cool about this movie. And I think Anthony brought up a lot of things that I do like really admire about it on like many levels. I think like on the kind of the emotional levels and that feeling of the mysteriousness of the future coming back to kill us, which is a theme from older, like, other sci-fi movies. I mean, compare this to like Looper, for example. I was just thinking of like Looper, where that's like a more like much more clear, easily manageable, like time travel story. Also about the future kind of coming back to kill us in a way. Terminator obviously is like the big one, so it's like, it's kind of a time honored like trope, but I think it's brilliant what you're saying, Anthony, that it's like the fact that we never even see the future. And as far as we can tell, it's exactly the same, it seems to be sending bullets back, bombs, things like this. Like it just feels like it's the same world, and there's something kind of dismal about that. But I can't quite read into the confusion aspects. I think we're supposed to, I think I see you're saying, Anthony, that there's an element of the confusion plays into our, befuddlement at our reality. But I didn't quite get that as I was watching. But if I could know one kind of thematic thing, and I think Kirk was kind of getting onto this too, kind of like the fact that the dialogue is kind of bad in a way. And by that, I'll give you an example. So when the protagonist, John David Washington, he says, when he's being like frisked as he's about to enter the big bad guy's like dinner party, he's like, he's being frisked. He's just like, usually where I'm from, you have to like buy me dinner first. I mean, how incredibly corny and bad. And Nolan knows that. But it's like at that time, I don't know, like you feel like this protagonist is having a fantasy of being like a James Bond, that this feels like a fantasy, feels like a dream almost. And I know it feels like, we already had the dream thing in Inception, but I think powerfully this movie has that feeling. And I think that's something that's actually Nolan is so great at. And I think he's uniquely gifted at creating that dreamlike texture, which frankly, like, is also kind of in Dunkirk too. It's kind of just his style, but here especially, it comes across like very powerfully. And I think like there's a couple moments, like, again, the kind of generic quality of everything, the polish, and the kind of feeling that like maybe a thematic thing too is, I think one thing I was noticing as I was watching again is how often everything that we see is kind of a liminal space. And it's kind of a term that has lost a lot of its meaning. It's word liminal, but like on the threshold between two things By that I would mean like there's a lot of motion, there's a lot of vehicles, a yacht, a boat, there are multiple boat trips. Obviously that serves the idea of like we can see time reverse. The airport, right, this kind of holding space for art that's kind of not, it's between. I could go on and on. Even kind of the decor, there's this feeling of kind of hotel rooms, and this is something that Nolan kind of did in Inception too. These kind of liminal spaces that feel kind of, you never feel quite at home. There's something like very, very thoughtful and very cool about that. And combined with this kind of feeling of that Kirk was mentioning, of this like kind of around the world, kind of snapshot, scrolling through Instagram, kind of look at, all these pretty parts of the world. There's this feeling of just of this lack of home, this kind of rootlessness, this kind of just, I don't know, there's something kind of postmodern or feels of our modern moment. And I could say some cool Adam Curtis thing about that. I think there's something about that that's very cool. But, I'm trying to find a lot of like meaning in that. Whereas it's just like, I don't know really what to make of that. But I think definitely he's doing something of what you're talking about, Anthony, but maybe it doesn't land and it doesn't fit all together in my head as well as it may for you.
Yeah, and I think the one thing though I'll pick up from that before I go to Tony is thinking about the liminal spaces of everything, the airport, the boat. Though even though we're in these like grand cities, the fact that almost everything feels the same wherever we are, we're in like these non-places. We live in a Twilight world and there's no friends at dusk, which connects so well with Twilight Princess, the great Zelda game, which is a facet for Connor to discuss in the commentary. But let's go to Tony. So hearing what you could of Connor and I guess my sort of approach to it, what are your own sort of thoughts? Because I was kind of curious when you brought up like the 21st century aspect of this. Connor brought up like Terminator and other stuff, which is about the future haunting us, but there we see the future as kind of like barren apocalyptic scenarios, whereas here it's empty from us. We're just stuck. It may be a future that's not that far different, but worsened by global warming, if you believe in that reading. But what do you think of that stuff, or what was your kind of 21st century thought?
Yeah, I guess I feel like the line you said of like don't try to understand it, just feel it. I noticed that as well. And I think that was sort of a coy little acknowledgement on Nolan's part. It's similar to the Swiss watch shot in Inception, very early, similar point in the film. It happens like 20 minutes in or something. Yeah. So it feels like, this stuff can't all be by accident, right? He's an experienced enough and a competent enough filmmaker that like this confusion, which is a criticism that's been levied at him for other movies, most notably Inception. I think it's almost him playing into that, criticism. And I think going for almost a transcendent or like a sublime confusion. The only moment in the movie that actually hits that point for me is the sequence with the car chase, that sequence with like the symmetrical car chase where you see it from both sides. And in the middle, they're in that chamber. And Kenneth Branagh is talking backwards because he's inverted. And from our perspective, we're not inverted. So we're hearing him in inverted. And then you see him put on the face mask. It's almost like a Frank Booth moment. He's just shot his wife. And there's just like the violence of it. Like the violence, the domestic violence in this movie is actually like kind of intense, like more than I remembered. I'm like, there's scenes where it was kind of that are like a little bit uncomfortable to watch when he's like screaming at her and terrorizing her. He puts his foot over her face. It's kind of like ugly. And like, that's not typical of his films to like go in the violence against women has happened in the past off screen typically. But, something about that combination of that extreme violence with that, like hearing him speak backwards and just that feeling of menace, but also incomprehensibility, which I think gels very nicely with their idea of this anonymous future, these anonymous actors in the future that are trying to kill us for reasons that aren't entirely clear. I think there's something about that that's very cool. And I agree too about the protagonist, like that moment, like where I'm come from, you buy me dinner first. Like, I feel like that line, like, yes, it's a cheesy line, but I feel like if it were to be delivered in a different way or by a different actor, perhaps it could have like gotten a cheap chuckle or something. But his delivery is so like just corny and weird and lacking. And I don't know. But that happens like 3 or 4 times. He'll make these like kind of James Bond, like sly little cracks, and they never land. And I do, it almost does feel like sort of like this role playing or fantasy a little bit of being a spy. This is true too in the scene with Michael Caine. Michael Caine almost in like a cameo here, where they're at the very fancy restaurant. We don't see what they're eating, but it's probably like a Michelin star, like a bird fetus drowned in gold, whatever, that costs $600. And he orders it, and then Michael Caine says, "Oh, if you're trying to pass as a billionaire, Brooks Brothers won't cut it." And he gives him a credit card and basically just says, "Have fun, buddy. Like, buy whatever you want." And just the idea of like the cool clothes, the speedboats, just being around this just background of just opulence, So I mean, I'm not sure how much that all comes together, or if he's making a commentary on this wealth, on this opulence. I think that Nolan is unironically pretty enamored with like cool cars and expensive suits and stuff. I think he thinks that stuff is cool. And that's also just a convention of the spy movie. That's like half the pleasure of James Bond. It's like the fantasy of you get to drive the Aston Martin. But the movie is also weirdly like asexual as well, unlike a Bond movie. I don't know how all those things come together. And I think that's my ultimately where I leave it. I will say, though, to answer your original question, I do not like being confused about the plot when I watch a movie. Like, I can be confused about what a shot means, or like how we're supposed to feel about a character or this or that or what. But if I literally don't understand what's going on, I find that I'm very frustrated. And maybe that makes me a child on some level, but that's how I engage.
Yeah. Well, okay, we'll start wrapping things up. But a couple things is, one is another great line in that Michael Caine scene, just before he addresses how he needs to do better than Brooks Brothers. I actually like David Washington's delivery of lines because they feel stuttered. They feel almost amateurish. They feel like he is thinking on the spot to me. And one of my favorite moments is when he's in that restaurant and he asks them if they do takeout boxes. And the guy this shakes his head, this waiter, just with this look of disgust. And it's this great to me moment that just says so much about this character. But the other part is, because you brought up a great word about how this movie is very asexual. Let me just say is this movie needs to be asexual because it fits in with the reading of this, right? This is almost the Children of Men reading, in that how long can we survive without anything new, right? What can we imagine a future like without something new, whether it's children, whether it's this new ideas, a new world? And yet we don't have a love story. There's a version of this movie where the protagonist ends up with Kat. He saves her from her like horrible domestic relationship. But instead, Kat is this very fascinating kind of woman who really does care about her son. She believes in this kind of idealistic world. She believes in kind of pulling back from the ideology of this violence happening. She's all in it just to kind of save that child. But at the same time, she's like this art like dealer who actually can't tell what's fake from what's real. And it becomes this kind of interesting underlying idea throughout the movie that never fully gets addressed in like a sort of satisfying way, but it's also there. What else can we do? What's real? What's fake to us? Can we look past what may be forgery for something authentic, for something that actually has potential to change things? Which I think, is all there for us on a kind of third, fourth view, if we could just lend ourselves over to it. Then maybe I want to give the movie too much credit. So anyway, as we start moving towards the wrapping up of this, does anyone have any final thoughts? I know I hogged a lot of the questions. It's just, a very Anthony film to do this for.
Kirk, are you going to give this a fourth viewing?
A fourth viewing? No, I just, like you said, Tony, like you had said, I'm not sure if maybe I'll mature. There's some pathology involved. I'll say that for sure. But in terms of how I watch movies, but I would say though that some of the dialogue, it's kind of like wink, wink. Like, I know this is bad. Like, I'm playing a role here because, spies fill roles. And so maybe he's like playing like this lazy spy or like, I don't know. But yeah, it comes down to the idea of like, if a director is making a decision, an artistic decision that objectively lowers my enjoyment of the film, is there something else I can extract from it that makes that worth it? So That's kind of an interesting thought, and like the idea of this dissociation of the liminal spaces of kind of the cheesy dialogue, the action that can at times feel unnatural and stilted, and like I said, the flooding of these novel concepts and challenging all these things in the moment. So I'm curious, it is kind of like the sum is greater than each individual part, perhaps.
Yeah, interesting.
And I'll just vote, since I just kind of talked. So I will say that this one is probably, it's hard, because I could in like 10 years be like, how the fuck did I vote no for Tenet? But I wouldn't be Kirk if I voted yes for this.
Kirk,
actually.
in 10 years, you vote yes. I'm telling you. I've come from.
Isn't that, see, that's I don't know. It's so damn like adventurous, and like it takes a lot of risks, and I really appreciate it. But just in terms of my viewing pleasure, I'll just say no, and that's kind of usually the metric I go by.
Interesting. All right, guys. I think in reality, in 10 years, this is a future classic. Everyone on Reddit's talking about this episode and how whoever voted no is a horrible person. So Kirk,
it's like voting for the Iraq War.
We'll go to Tony.
Okay, yeah. So I will say, glad this movie exists. Glad it was made. I'm glad Christopher Nolan can just like literally get $300 million for anything. I support that. But yeah, this one didn't really do it for me. I think there's a lot of interesting ideas in it, but I can't pull out a really coherent and satisfying read that will make up for my kind of alternating boredom and confusion in actually watching this 2.5 hour film. So unfortunately, I will vote no on Tenet.
All right, listeners, Tony hasn't been the same since law school and joining the legal workforce, so it's sad. But all right, Connor, you got kind of a symbolic vote here.
Too late, I'm afraid, Anthony, but only in this last minute have I arrived at the grand reading that would have changed Tony's mind and made him vote yes. Here's the reading. Okay. So in this world, this postmodern, late capitalist, social media hellscape we live in, we are all the protagonists. We are all Joe Blow, but we all want to be the protagonist. That is, we have to first die, then we have the dream, perhaps the only dream that can take us out of this reality, to avert the sameness of the future. We need to class things up a little by meeting with Michael Caine, yes, getting the credit card from him, getting new clothes, bespoke stuff, classing ourselves up. That's kind of the dream. Maybe that's part of the answer. But then also, we need to have the British friend of our fantasies, the classy English guy who's our homie, who knows like what our favorite drink is, and who in the end, as you can find out if you watch the ending explained, he says goodbye to him. It's actually the beginning of their friendship, but it's actually the end, because after Robert Pattinson says goodbye, he immediately gets into a helicopter, goes back into a reverse machine, is inverted, then goes back into the battle to get shot by the guy at the end in front of the door. And that's how we're all saved. And yes, culture as well. And our future for humanity is restored. Sorry, so no. I'm gonna say no. But you had me going there, Anthony, when you started getting me on the whole. With your legitimate, I think, points about the aesthetics and the kind of themes. I think there's something actually very interesting there, but I just don't think it's very good on a just pure like watchability level. If it had achieved kind of more on that level, I think, but it's just, I think it needed to be a bit more of a watchable film than it is.
All right, 3 no's. This goes in the Hall of Fame of Anthony films to receive universal rejections with Stoker. I can't remember if there's another one, but look forward to my writings on it in postmodernism, time, literature, and hellscapes in Christopher Nolan's Tenet. So moving on. This was a dud for everybody. Let's see if they Want to save the
Fun
day,
episode,
save
though.
the podcast. Yes, for next week. So everyone's final section, our favorite section, in which these three nominated film, I'll pick one for us to watch next week. As of a few episodes ago, we have changed the rules. Whoever claims a movie's decade wipes that decade off for the other voters or for the other nominators. So Kirk's been on kind of a dry streak for a while. Nothing's happening. He's throwing some great films out, but no one's biting. So, Kirk, how would you like to order this today?
Okay, so get this. Sing 2. It's a great movie, all right? It's really good. Got a lot of cameos. No. I'll go first, and then probably have Connor in the middle there. The middleman, Mr. Connor. So yeah, I'll go first, just out of concern for the decade. I got one I did nominate, but it was, oh boy, it was pre-Abbey Road, before we moved into our new studios. No, it was back in our Liverpool days for sure. And I don't think I nominated it to, I think I nominated it to Connor, but I think Anthony, you're a basketball fan. We have never done a sports movie. Am I correct on that? I don't think we ever have. Maybe wrong. The subreddit will correct me. Also, we're a little light on documentaries. Throw that all into one. We got Hoop Dreams '94. Who did Hoop Dreams? Steve James. Not really sure if he did anything else of significance. I think he, usually. He was the director of Life Itself. Of Ebert, right? Yeah, Ebert. Yeah, sorry, lost the name for a second. But yeah, so Hoop Dreams follows two Black adolescents in high school in inner city Chicago in the 90s. It's kind of a chronology of their experience, their relationship to the sport. I think something that people who don't enjoy sports miss often is how steeped in metaphor sports actually are, and how you can how people can really thrive and feel that power, that metaphorical power, or I guess literal power in a sense, like if you're dominating something, like if you're the best, right? But how we can take that, and also, I mean, there's the racial elements, how you have to be the best at what you do. If you're Black and you live in like the inner city of a place like Chicago in the Midwest, highly segregated, especially in the 90s, there's a lot of social problems. You got Daley as the mayor, I believe, still. And yeah, it's fantastic. It really is. It's fantastic. It's not even like screw you guys, I'm gonna pick something I just want to watch. Like it's objectively good, and I think it will fill a little gap in our canon, which is like sports themed, and also just looking a little more critically at race, which sometimes I feel like we neglect at times, or can, it's hard to
addressed
judge,
it in Clown Alice, I think.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a good one. I'm excited to hear the other options too.
All right, interesting nomination.
Suppose it's me next. This is a little tough. This is a little bit of a risky one, but I've had this one in mind for a long time. We're talking 1982, not necessarily my favorite decade. You might have expected 1960 something or 20 something, but no, 1982. Paul Bartel directed Eating Raoul, which is a film that I would describe as a sex comedy with a horror twist that involves sort of kinks, cannibalism, a little bit of a shocker, but mostly its main note is that it is comic. It is an extremely funny movie, kind of a great example, kind of deadpan comedy. Very hard to describe. I mean, I think it stars Paul Bartel, the director, and Mary Woronov, who would kind of appear in a bunch of films together, often as like a married couple. They have this kind of comic duo kind of sensibility about them. They're very interesting. They're both very interesting figures with a unique kind of like sensibility. I don't know. It's just, I think it would be very cool. I've watched this a very long time. It was one of the first like movies I really got into, or not got into, but it was part of my early kind of film awakening. I watched this movie on cable one night and I was like, wow, like this is pretty cool. Like imagine all the other cool movies that are out there. So yeah, it's a little bit twisted, a little dark, perhaps a little offensive, but I think it might be interesting, compared to today too. It feels very different, right? It's about kind of, the smuttiness of our reality. And I wonder if it would still feel, pertinent to today, or maybe not. Maybe it feels kind of completely the opposite. I don't know. But yeah, it's my pick.
All right, interesting. So documentary to a sort of horror comedy or dark comedy. What do you got, Tony?
Well, I've got a sex comedy documentary. No, well, I do have a documentary actually from the 2000s. I debated whether to pitch it this week because I think this is a very strong pick. I know I just went, so I don't know if I want to throw it, but I guess I could pitch it again anytime. This is from 2003. I think Connor watched this kind of recently. I don't know if Anthony's seen it or Kirk. This is Los Angeles Plays Itself by Tom Anderson. This is a 3-hour film essay about the history of Los Angeles on film. The 3 hours absolutely flies by. This is, I think, one of the all-time great works of film criticism, and it's an incredible achievement. Just the sheer number of clips Anderson is able to pull, the incredible depth of his knowledge. Basically, we're seeing the whole movie is film clips with a voiceover, and the voiceover is brilliantly written and delivered. It's got a great voice. It's kind of wryly funny. It's very interesting. It's erudite. It's just a really interesting movie. It's just sitting in a cozy room with a very smart person who knows a lot about movies, talking about this specific topic with a level of depth and detail you're unlikely to find basically anywhere else. I love this movie. It's a great experience. It's a great watch. And if either of you have not seen it, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. I think you would both love it.
All right. So Tony wanted to join in the documentary race, Kirk. He's coming after you. But what do we have for rebuttals? My mind's split between the three. All sound great. All are interesting in their own ways. But what do we have?
Well, Anthony, this movie is for anybody who's had aspirations and has found themselves in situations that aren't necessarily within their control. Not to this extent, of course. I've never experienced anything like anything that is portrayed in the film. I've experienced similar circumstances or situations, but I think the similes play. I think it's very digestible. It's a longer film like Tony's. I think it's 2 hours 50. It does fly as well. I mean, you feel like kind of that 90s mystique that we all, that feels very retro, but at the time, this was the era of Jordan and like the evolution of basketball into this international thing, right? Like post Magic and Bird, and we have this new kind of international product, and the idea of marketing basketball players as celebrities and stars. And this was also post Magic HIV diagnosis, so there's a lot of stuff to talk about. Anthony, I know you're a huge basketball fan. I don't know if you're still up on it, but I'm pretty sure you are. But and it would also be interesting because I don't think Connor and Tony are necessarily super professional sports inclined, at least from what I know of both of you, so it would be interesting in that sense as well. I'm curious about the other two, especially like Tony's, but also Connor, in the sense that if he said it was kind of formative for him, that's interesting to me as well. But yeah, I don't know. There's a certain, the real to life, like that really kind of somber quality that you see, but also really humbling quality when you see folks that are in very dire circumstances but are somehow able to transcend those. And I think that's very like we like to think that's American, but also there's also a subversion of that expectation within the documentary itself, just through how it plays out. So throughout the storytelling. So I think it's a good choice.
All right, very strong, passionate defense. Connor.
Well, you're right, Kirk. I don't even watch hockey. Sorry, no. But no, I think to Kirk's point, he makes a very valid point about like the way that I might overlook, both aspects of his film, right? Both the sports aspect and the documentary aspect. I think I haven't maybe given either of those things their due, like for this podcast or otherwise in terms of watching film. But I will say that whenever I watch like sports documentaries, I really do love them because as Kirk points out, like, I don't know, there's something very like just obviously metaphorical about sports. Again, like art, it kind of helps us to like, tell stories about our reality. It kind of condenses our experience into an intense, climactic thing. So I think it's a very cool thing. And I think I was the one who turned down Hoop Dreams at first, but I have to say, I mean, it does sound very appealing to me. And as for Tony's, I would say, well, I've seen it very recently. I can't knock its greatness. This is a pretty great movie. It's quite a comprehensive look at Los Angeles, and I think it's really more than a movie about film. It's really about Los Angeles as it appears in film, and I have my gripes with it as well. But I think it will make for an interesting episode if we do it. But I would like to announce or point out that I currently have the shortest movie of all three of the recommenders, which is incredible. Unprecedented event. And let me just tantalize you, Anthony, with a little bit of a plot synopsis, or a plot summary. So basically, it's about this married couple that becomes involved in swinging by accident. They don't really know what they're getting into, and they realize that they can make a lot of money by actually killing these swingers, by luring them into their home, and then taking their money and using that to pay for rent and for buying expensive wine, which is like their hobby. So that's what it's all about. And it's interesting and it's very funny in a way that, you can kind of feel from the kind of that sort of comedy sensibility of the 70s and 80s. It's very wacky, certainly feels different from today. It may totally be a cancelable offense. So if you would like to cancel me live on the podcast, you can do that. But let me know that that's an option.
All right, interesting. Connor threw down the 90-minute mark, or the short length of this compared to the almost 3-hour documentaries of the other two. But Tony, what's your defense of Tom Anderson's LA Plays Itself?
Well, Anthony, you have a question to ask yourself. Are you a 90-minute mark, or are you a 180-minute Mac? And that's the kind of guy you got to be on this podcast to make it work. Okay, listen, this movie is a guaranteed hit for everybody. I don't say that lightly. I don't typically say that, but I think this is a movie that, yes, we do need to do more documentaries. And I've been meaning to see Hoop Dream for forever. I really want to see that movie. I hadn't really heard much about Eating Raoul or the Zack Snyder movie about owls. I don't know, but it sounds interesting and I want to watch it. But I think that I just feel like this is a movie that has all the quadrants. It hits all our stuff, and it's a movie about movies. And we always say that, but it truly, literally is. And I think it'll be very interesting to compare our respective kind of repertoires or our respective kind of base of knowledge and just compare it to, it's just minds coming into contact, and it's a really fascinating thing. And I think also just like to pay respect to like, it's a movie that impresses you that it was made, like how much effort went into assembling it. And I think that deserves to be celebrated, even if that doesn't make it good in itself. But I think these all sound like good choices, so I won't be upset if you pick any of them.
All right, cool. So these are all, I think, very strong choices and very off kilter for everybody. On any other day, I might have picked someone else's or another nominator's film. I've seen 2 of the 3, actually, though, which is different too. I've seen Hoop Dreams, but way back in high school, about the search for the next Isaiah Thomas. And what I remember is really, really being captivated by it then. And I remember thinking, and I still think this now, this is like comparable to like The Wire in depicting this mode of life that's distant from at least the 4 of us, I would feel safe in presuming. Tony's, your film, I love it. I absolutely love LA Plays Itself. It's one of my favorite films I've seen in the last couple of years. I actually love it so much I bought the Blu-ray, which I never do because I'm so afraid it's going to disappear for how much footage it's going to use, and or for the copyright issues. Connor's film is interesting because it doesn't sound like a typical Connor nomination. It's short. It has a kind of humorous, surrealistic sound to it that's intriguing. So now I'm going to disqualify LA Plays Itself. One, because I think it's super fascinating, and actually, like Transit, that I like insisted Kirk should watch for like years. I felt like I really want Kirk to watch that movie, but I honestly want to hear Kirk speak about it for like an hour and a half straight, because Kirk has a better knowledge of LA and like its architecture, its infrastructure than I do. And I grew up around the area. And in fact, I was just there and like I was thinking about that movie, and I'm still thinking about it. And I love so much of it.
Yeah.
Were you say
No, I was
something,
gonna say
Tony?
there's a lot of art for Kirk. Like there's a lot of architecture talk.
Yeah,
Like,
and just the
guys into
skyline
buildings.
talk. Yeah, like I think Kirk would really love it, and I want to hear more about it, but I want to hear just Kirk unfiltered speak about it, honestly. So maybe we'll renominate that, and someone will be brave and pick it, or great pick it. So this is tough because I'm tempted to go with Connor's film in the sense of like it sounds like the kind of humorous thing I need, but I'm going to do something different. I do think we need to fill in the sports urge, so I'm going to go with Hoop Dreams. And I think what other sports film would ever be picked? I don't know. Maybe there's something, but I really actually think that this is like an interesting watch, not just as like a social commentary, as Kirk was alluding to, but as a documentary. And I think we're all going to get something out of it that's different than what we've kind of done in the last few weeks. So Hoop Dreams, directed by someone.
Yeah, there you go. I think it was Steve James. Yeah, I'll have all the details. We're gonna have Carl Anthony Towns on the podcast. He's gonna talk about his impending trade. He's gonna ask out of Minnesota. No, Anthony and I are just gonna throw around all these names and terms and just flaunt our sports knowledge. No, but thank you, Anthony, and I'm very excited to watch Hoop Dreams. And I will say, LA Plays Itself, like for sure. I wanted mine to get chosen, so I'm not going to be like, hey, pick, but like, yeah, it does sound like right up my alley for sure. I'll probably watch it in the next few weeks. And then Connor's, your sounds pretty damn funny, just the premise itself. So I'm sure it's really good. But Anthony, what were you going to say? What's the takeaway here?
Oh.
Make sure I read the Wikipedia article about basketball before.
I will become a Chad.
Just follow the Tenet explained.
Hoop Dreams ending explained.
Exactly. Well, I'll have what she's having.